One morning, a river was suddenly full of lifeless bodies floating on the water's surface. When the police arrived and flipped the bodies over, their faces turned pale with terror. Every single body had been completely drained of all its moisture. The situation was deeply strange, and the number of victims kept growing. Crucially, every single victim was found dead in the river, and all of them were in the exact same dried-out state. There was a man named Jae-hyuk who worked as a salesman for a medicine company. That same day, he was playing golf with some clients. One of his clients started acting very strangely by drinking huge amounts of water. Even after finishing several bottles, he was still overcome with extreme thirst. In the end, the client leaped directly into the river. Just a few seconds later, his body floated back to the surface. Jae-hyuk ran over to pull him out, but the man had already turned into a terrifying, dry corpse. Jae-hyuk was terrified by what happened. Later that morning, he watched the news and learned that similar dead bodies were turning up all across Korea. He had no idea earlier that his own client had suffered that exact same fate. Since his business meeting had failed, he decided to head back home. But when he walked through the door, he was shocked to see his wife and children drinking water like crazy. Panic set in. He quickly helped the kids get dressed and tried to rush them all to the hospital. Meanwhile, the police began examining the dried-out corpses. They discovered one key detail connecting all the victims. Every single person had visited that same river to play not long before dying. Jae-hyuk's brother, Jae-pil, was a police officer. He received orders to visit a small village near the river to investigate the local water source. However, the local villagers were angry with the police. They worried that an ongoing investigation would scare tourists away and ruin their town's reputation, meaning nobody would ever come back to play. Because of the hostile villagers, Jae-pil was forced to sleep in his car that night. When he woke up the next morning, he was completely stunned to see the entire river filled with dead bodies once again. At first, the police suspected the water had been poisoned. But after running tests on the water, they found no toxic chemicals, only some strange insect eggs. Around the same time, someone called in to report that a family member had just died inside their bathtub. When the police rushed inside the house, they were met with a gruesome scene. Long, thin worms were crawling directly out of the victim's body. Medical experts studied the creatures and realized they were a new mutated type of nematode worm. Normally, these hairworms only live inside insects, but this mutated version had evolved to live inside human bodies. When the time comes for them to lay eggs, they trigger the human brain's nerves so the host will go near water, allowing the worms to leave the body and reproduce. The mutated worms enter human bodies through either the mouth or the anus. Unaware of the parasites inside them, infected humans provide the worms with plenty of nutrients through their daily food. As the worms grow into adults, they manipulate the human brain to create an overwhelming feeling of thirst. This thirst grows so intense that victims lose control and jump into natural bodies of water on their own. Once in the water, the worms break out of the host's body to lay their eggs and multiply. When news of the parasite broke out, nationwide panic erupted because that river serves as Korea's primary drinking water supply. Hospitals were quickly overwhelmed with desperate patients. Unfortunately, doctors could not remove the worms using surgery because the parasites attached themselves tightly to the human intestines. One medical expert suggested they try using a specific anti-worm drug. However, before they could even finish testing it, a new emergency arrived at the hospital. A young girl who had taken the anti-worm drug began foaming at the mouth and screaming out in agony. A few moments later, she passed away. Left without a proven medical solution, the government had no choice but to gather all infected patients inside hospital facilities. What they did not realize was that the worm attacks occur in sudden group clusters. When one infected person suffers an attack, everyone infected nearby experiences an attack at the exact same moment. Slowly, the trapped crowd began to grow wild and restless. At the same time, Jae-hyuk's family was at home trying to pack their bags. Suddenly, his wife stared at the water faucet with a look of desperate, wild hunger in her eyes. She plunged her head straight into the filled sink. Jae-hyuk scrambled to pull her up, but her mind was completely gone and she was trying to drown herself for water. The children lost control as well. His son kept gulping down water continuously while his daughter began banging wildly against the window. Jae-hyuk fought desperately to hold on to his wife, who was trying to break out of the house. He quickly pulled his daughter back inside, wrapped his arms tightly around his children, and locked his legs around his wife to physically restrain them. Outside, the infected crowd had completely lost control. People were running down the streets like mindless zombies in search of any water they could find. Some threw themselves into park fountains, while others slammed their heads into glass fish tanks along the sidewalk. The entire city descended into chaos. As people watched the horror unfold, an elderly villager came forward with a crucial piece of information. He remembered seeing someone dump a sick dog into the river one night. To protect the village's tourist money, the old man had secretly pulled the dead dog out and buried it without telling anyone. That hidden secret was the direct trigger for the horrific outbreak happening today. Just as everyone was losing hope, a patient who had completely recovered arrived at the hospital. Doctors checked him and found that he had taken a specific anti-parasite medication made by a particular pharmaceutical company. It turned out that Jae-hyuk's own company used to manufacture this exact drug. However, production had been stopped long ago, and every local pharmacy was already completely sold out of remaining stock. Meanwhile, government officials reached out to the executives of the pharmaceutical company, begging them to start making the anti-parasite drug again. At the hospital, infected patients and their family members were kept in strict isolation. Jae-hyuk could only talk to his sick wife through a glass window. During the night, the infected people suddenly suffered another massive group attack. They smashed through barriers, ran into the streets, and threw themselves into the river without hesitation. By morning, the river was once again floating with corpses. Making matters even worse, the production equipment at the pharmaceutical factory had been completely shut down. Company bosses refused to share the chemical recipe for the drug. These greedy business executives were trying to force the government into buying out their entire company for a massive price. Because of their greed, negotiations came to a complete standstill. With help from a coworker, Jae-hyuk managed to buy a single box of the medicine secretly from the inside at an extremely high price. But as he received it, the surrounding crowd noticed the package and frantically attacked him, stealing every last pill. After seeing the mob scene, his coworker mentioned that a large supply of the drug had existed right before it was discontinued. Someone must have bought up the entire stock on purpose to create an artificial shortage. Hearing this, Jae-hyuk searched online and managed to track down an underground drug dealer. He met up with the dealer to make the trade, but just as they were about to swap the money, the police unexpectedly arrived. Scared of getting caught, the dealer dumped all the precious medication into the toilet and flushed it down, destroying the last remaining supply. Jae-hyuk collapsed in total despair. Right at that hopeless moment, Jae-pil called his brother with major news. He had located the exact warehouse where the missing medicine was being hidden. Jae-hyuk jumped into his car and sped toward the location immediately. Back at the isolation facility, an infected woman lifted a huge bucket of water and poured it down her throat as fast as she could. She did not care if her stomach burst from the volume. The parasite inside her body had completely hijacked her mind. The intense thirst had stripped away all her human reason. Suddenly, her husband wrapped his arms around her from behind and pleaded, "Think about our child." Hearing his words, the woman snapped out of her trance and stopped drinking. At the same time, as Jae-hyuk was searching everywhere for the pills, Jae-pil called him with another update. He had found the current location of a former researcher who used to work for the pharmaceutical company. The two brothers met up and confronted the researcher, forcing him to finally tell the whole truth behind the outbreak. The researcher confessed that the high-ranking officials of the pharmaceutical company had intentionally released the mutated worms into the river water just to make money. First, the conspirators bought up large amounts of stock in the company. Then, they waited for the parasite to spread across the country. Once the public panic drove the company's stock price sky-high, they planned to release their hidden stash of medicine, sell their inflated stock, and walk away with massive profits. Jae-hyuk and Jae-pil rushed to the secret warehouse where the medicine was stored. But as soon as they stepped inside, someone locked the doors from the outside. A burning lighter was thrown into the room, instantly setting the boxes of medicine on fire. Jae-hyuk tried to throw himself into the flames to save the boxes, but Jae-pil tackled him, and held him back. Trapped inside the growing fire, both brothers slowly lost consciousness from the heavy smoke. Out of nowhere, a heavy truck smashed straight through the warehouse walls, saving their lives. The driver was Jae-pil's girlfriend. As soon as Jae-hyuk woke up, his first instinct was to run back into the burning building. But when he reached the pile, there was not a single usable pill left, only pile of ashes. He broke down in tears, holding the warm ash in his hands, wondering how he could possibly save his family now. At the end of his rope, Jae-hyuk suddenly remembered a key fact about making drugs. The most critical part is the raw active ingredient. If they could just get their hands on the raw chemical formula, any medical factory could manufacture the pills. The two brothers split up to take action. Jae-pil headed to the isolation center to guard their family, while Jae-hyuk sped toward the main chemical plant to search for the raw ingredients. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, a patient's body became so packed with mature worms that the parasites burst violently out of his skin. People inside the room screamed in sheer terror. Seeing the horrifying sight, Jae-hyuk's wife quickly covered her child's eyes. But a moment later, the child whispered that his throat was feeling scratchy. The worms inside the boy were beginning to move. The mother was terrified of what might happen next, but all she could do was squeeze her son tightly in her arms. Exhausted and dizzy, her mind began to wander. She looked up at the emergency water sprinklers on the ceiling, desperately wishing for water to shower down on them. Her eyes slowly shifted toward the manual fire alarm switch on the wall. Suddenly, another infected woman who had completely lost her sanity began stumbling toward the fire switch to trigger the sprinklers. The mother jolted alert and tackled the woman to stop her from setting off the water. A physical fight broke out between them, which drew the attention of the surrounding infected crowd. The crowd swarmed over and pinned the mother down, leaving her helpless to stop them. Jae-pil saw the chaos through the glass window, but he was locked out and could not break into the room. Thinking fast, he sprinted upstairs as quickly as possible and shut off the main water valve for the entire building. His quick thinking saved the patients from drowning themselves for the moment, though everyone knew that if the parasites remained inside them much longer, their bodies would eventually burst. At that exact moment, Jae-hyuk arrived at the chemical storage facility and searched frantically for the raw ingredients. Finally, he located the supply. He immediately handed the materials over to the medical research team. Thanks to his desperate efforts, pharmaceutical factories all across the country began producing the anti-parasite medicine at maximum speed. The life-saving drugs were quickly distributed to every region, and the public finally saw a ray of hope. Jae-hyuk's wife and children were given the medicine and fully cured. At the same time, the Prime Minister was just about to sign the overpriced contract to buy out the corrupt pharmaceutical company when he suddenly tore the papers to pieces. It turned out the police had uncovered the entire criminal plot and arrested the company's head representative. The evil scheme was exposed to the public, and the greedy businessmen were brought to justice. The horrific national crisis was finally over. However, far away from the city, an infected corpse was quietly floating downstream toward a distant shore, hinting that the nightmare might not be completely over after all.